Transfer letter sat on the passenger seat of my truck for the entire 11-hour drive north. I did not need to read it again. I had memorized every line of it during the first week after it arrived, had traced my thumb across the embossed National Park Service letterhead so many times that the gold seal had begun to wear smooth. Seasonal Field Ranger, Lake Anahke Station, Okanogan Wilderness, Northern Washington. Reporting date, September 2nd. I took the job because my marriage had ended 4 months prior in a quiet, bloodless way that somehow hurt worse than if there had been screaming. Rosalind had simply placed her ring on the kitchen counter one Tuesday morning and told me she could not keep pretending she recognized the person I had become. I did not argue. I understood what she meant. The version of me that had come back from 2 seasons of fire suppression work in Montana was not the same man she had married. I had stopped sleeping through the night. I flinched at the sound of the propane stove clicking to life. I had developed a habit of checking the tree line behind our apartment building in Bozeman every evening before I could settle enough to eat dinner. So when the posting came through the internal job board, a solo station on a lake so remote it did not appear on most commercial maps, I filled out the application within the hour. I needed silence. I needed distance from every place that reminded me of who I had been before. The road into the Anahke Basin was not really a road at all. Past the final Forest Service gate, it became a pair of ruts cut into the earth by decades of supply trucks, each one a little wider than the last, the center hump scraping the undercarriage of my pickup with a grinding moan that set my teeth on edge. Lodgepole pines grew so close on either side that their lower branches dragged across my mirrors, leaving resin smears on the glass. The GPS had stopped updating 40 minutes earlier. I was navigating by a photocopied map that the district ranger, a broad-shouldered woman named Devlin Pratt, had mailed to me along with a list of supply recommendations and a single handwritten note at the bottom. Trust the quiet out there. It will take care of you if you let it. I did not understand what she meant by that until I arrived. Lake Anahke revealed itself the way all beautiful and terrible places do, suddenly and without warning. The trees parted, and the valley opened beneath me. A bowl of gray-green water, roughly 2 miles across, ringed on 3 sides by granite ridgelines that rose so steeply they seemed to lean inward, as if trying to close above the lake like a fist. The 4th side, the south shore where the access road terminated, was a long apron of gravel and deadfall that sloped gently to the waterline. The cabin sat 60 yards from the shore, a single-story log structure with a green metal roof, a stone chimney, and a narrow porch that faced the water. Behind it stood a smaller outbuilding that served as a tool shed and radio shelter. Beyond that, nothing. Just forest in every direction, thick and unbroken, running north into the mountains until the trees gave way to snowfields and bare rock. The name Anahke came from the Okanogan Salish people who had lived in these valleys long before any survey team or timber company arrived. I learned this from a binder that someone had assembled and left in the cabin, a collection of photocopied documents, hand-drawn maps, and faded newspaper clippings sealed in plastic sleeves. The word meant, roughly, the place that listens. There was a longer explanation in the binder, attributed to an ethnographer named Devereaux, who had spent 2 summers in the region during the 1930s, recording oral histories from elders in the Colville Confederated Tribes. According to Devereaux, the Salish had used the valley seasonally for hunting, but never established permanent camps near the lake itself. When pressed for a reason, one elder had told Devereaux that the lake was not hostile, but that it repeated things. Devereaux had interpreted this as a reference to the acoustic properties of the basin, the way the granite walls created unusually strong and sometimes distorted echoes. I unpacked my gear that first evening with the methodical slowness of a man who has no one waiting for him. Canned food went onto the pantry shelves. Firewood from the covered stack beside the shed went into the iron cradle near the stove. My sleeping bag went onto the cot in the single bedroom. My rifle, a bolt-action Remington 700 in Tie 308, went onto the wall rack beside the door, and 2 boxes of ammunition went into the drawer beneath it. The radio equipment was already installed, a base station unit on a desk beneath the front window, with a battery backup and a solar panel on the roof. I tested it and raised the repeater tower 40 miles south without difficulty. Devlin answered, confirmed my arrival, and told me my first supply drop would come by float plane in 12 days. That first night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the last light drain out of the sky. The silence was extraordinary. Not the silence of a quiet room, which is still full of the hum of appliances and the distant murmur of traffic, but the silence of a place that has never been wired for electricity, never heard an engine idle, never known the sound of human voices raised in conversation. The only sounds were the faint lapping of the lake against the gravel shore, and somewhere high on the eastern ridge, the thin, descending whistle of a varied thrush. I slept well that first night, deeply and without dreams. The silence wrapped around the cabin like a held breath, and I fell into it gratefully. It was the third night when I heard the first voice. I was lying on the cot with my eyes open, not quite asleep, listening to the wind shift through the pines, when a sound rose from the direction of the lake, a human voice, distant but distinct. It was calling a name, though I could not make out the word. The cadence was wrong in a way I could not immediately identify. The syllables stretched slightly too long, the intervals between repetitions too precise, as though whoever was calling had rehearsed the act of calling rather than performing it out of genuine urgency. I got up and went to the window. The moon was 3/4 full, and its light lay across the lake in a wide, trembling column. The shore was empty. The tree line was still. The voice came again, closer this time, and I realized what was wrong with it. It was not a single voice. It was 2 voices speaking the same word in near-perfect unison, one a half beat behind the other, creating a layered quality, like a recording played over itself with a fraction of a second delay. Then it stopped. The silence returned so completely that for a moment I wondered whether I had imagined the entire thing. I stood at the window for 20 minutes, my hand on the latch, before I returned to the cot. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I walked the shoreline in both directions for a 1/4 mile. I found no footprints, no campfire remains, no litter, no evidence of any human presence. The gravel was smooth and undisturbed. I told myself it had been a coyote, or perhaps a great horned owl, both of which could produce sounds that a tired mind might shape into human speech. I almost believed it. Devlin Pratt flew in on the supply plane 12 days later, sitting in the co-pilot seat of a de Havilland Beaver that touched down on the lake with a sound like tearing fabric. She was in her late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of sun-etched face that comes from 30 years of working above 6,000 feet. She helped me unload the cargo, canned goods and fuel canisters and a replacement battery for the radio, and then she stood on the shore and looked at the lake for a long time without speaking. I asked her how many rangers had worked this station before me. 11, she said. Over the past 19 years, the average tenure was 14 months. I asked her why people left. She was quiet for a while. Then she said that isolation was harder than most people expected, that the mountains did something to a person after enough time. She said that 2 rangers had requested emergency evacuation. One had been a 20-year veteran with commendations for backcountry rescue. He had radioed in at 3 in the morning, 6 months into his posting, and told Devlin that he needed to leave immediately. When she asked him what was wrong, he said only that something in the valley was learning him. He never elaborated on what he meant by that, and he never returned to field work. I told Devlin about the voice I had heard on my 3rd night. She nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something she already suspected. She told me about Merritt Calloway, a wildlife researcher who had operated out of the Anahke Station for 3 summers in the early 2000s, conducting a population survey of gray wolves in the basin. Calloway had kept detailed field notes, and copies of some of them were in the binder in the cabin. In his second summer, Calloway had begun documenting what he called acoustic anomalies, sounds that seemed to originate from the lake or the near shore that resembled human speech, laughter, or crying, but that occurred at times and in locations where no humans were present. Calloway had initially attributed them to the echo effect of the granite walls, noting that sounds could bounce off the ridgelines in complex ways. But by his third summer, his notes had taken on a different tone. He wrote that the sounds were responsive, that they changed in character depending on who was at the station, that they had begun incorporating specific words that he recognized, words he had spoken aloud in the days prior. In his final entry, dated August 14th, 2004, Calloway wrote, "It is not an echo. An echo repeats what you say. This repeats what you mean." Devlin told me that Calloway had left at the end of that summer and moved to a university position in Flagstaff. She had spoken to him once, several years later, and he had been polite but firm in his refusal to discuss his time at Anahke. Before she left, Devlin gave me a handheld GPS unit with the coordinates of every trail junction, creek crossing, and emergency cache within a 10-mile radius of the station. She also gave me a laminated card with the radio frequencies for the county search and rescue team, the state police aviation unit, and the nearest medical facility, a clinic in the town of Winthrop, 90 miles south. She paused at the door of the float plane and looked back at me. "Be careful with names out here," she said. "Do not say anyone's name loudly, especially near the water after sunset." She did not explain further. The plane taxied out, lifted off the lake, banked south, and was gone. For 3 weeks after that, nothing happened. I fell into the rhythm of the work. Morning weather observations, trail patrols on the south and east sides of the lake, water quality sampling at 3 designated points, radio check-ins at noon and 1800 hours, firewood, meals. The repetitive work of maintaining a station in a place where entropy moved faster than any single person could counter it. Shingles curled, hinges rusted. The porch steps developed a soft spot that I reinforced with scrap lumber from the shed. The days shortened. The light took on the thin amber quality of early autumn, and the nights grew cold enough that I kept the stove burning from sundown to dawn. I heard the voices 3 more times during those weeks, always at night, always from the direction of the lake. Each time, they were slightly different. The first sounded like a woman humming a melody I almost recognized, something slow and repetitive, like a lullaby. The second was a man speaking in a low, conversational tone, as if talking to someone beside him, though I could not make out individual words. The third was the clearest yet. It was my own voice. It said my name, once, in exactly the way I had said it into the radio during my noon check-in that same day. I stopped saying my name on the radio after that. I used my call sign only. The first lost hiker arrived on September 29th. I found him on the east trail at the base of the scree field below Pinnacle Ridge, sitting on a boulder with his backpack between his knees and a look on his face that I recognized immediately. It was the expression of a person who has realized, with full clarity, that they are alone in a place that does not care whether they live or die. His name was Soren Ainsley. He was 26 years old, from Portland, attempting a solo traverse of the ridge that he had read about on a hiking forum. He had lost the trail in a fog bank the previous afternoon and spent the night wedged into a rock crevice with nothing but a space blanket and a rapidly dying headlamp. He was hypothermic but coherent. I gave him hot water with electrolyte powder and walked him back to the station, where I wrapped him in wool blankets and fed him canned soup while he sat by the stove and shivered. That night, while Soren slept on the floor of the cabin in a borrowed sleeping bag, I sat at the desk monitoring the radio and heard something new. From the lake, clear and unmistakable, came the sound of a man crying, not sobbing, crying in the quiet, restrained way of someone who does not want to be heard. The sound carried across the water with impossible clarity, as if the source were standing 10 feet from the cabin rather than somewhere out on the open lake. I looked at Soren. He was asleep, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep exhaustion, but the crying from the lake matched his voice exactly. I recognized the timbre, the faint nasal quality, the way the breath hitched at the top of each exhalation. Whatever was out there had listened to Soren during the hours he had spent lost on the ridge, and now it was playing him back. I closed the window shutter and did not open it again until morning. By mid-October, I had begun to keep my own notes, not in the official logbook, which went by float plane to the district office every month, but in a separate notebook that I kept in the bottom of my pack. I recorded the date, time, weather conditions, and a description of every sound I heard that I could not explain. I also recorded any unusual animal behavior because by then, the animals had begun to change. It started with the birds, the varied thrushes, which had been singing their descending whistle every evening since my arrival, stopped abruptly on October 3rd, not a gradual decline, as you might expect with seasonal migration, but a complete cessation, as if someone had turned off a switch. That same week, I noticed that the ravens, which normally circled the station in loose groups of 3 or 4, scavenging for scraps, had begun to gather in much larger numbers. I counted 22 of them on the roof of the shed one morning, all facing the lake, all silent. When I walked outside, they did not scatter. They turned their heads to watch me, but did not move. They sat there for the entire day. Then the elk herd that I had been tracking on the eastern meadow changed its behavior. Elk are creatures of habit. They graze in the early morning and late afternoon, bed down in timber during midday, and move between sites along established trails. The Anahke herd had followed this pattern reliably for the first 6 weeks of my posting. In the second week of October, they stopped grazing. I found them standing in a tight cluster at the northern end of the meadow, 30 or more animals pressed together shoulder to shoulder, all facing south toward the lake. They were not feeding. They were not chewing cud. They were simply standing, motionless, their ears pinned forward, their nostrils flared, their eyes wide and fixed on something I could not see. I watched them through binoculars for over an hour. Not one animal moved. The next morning, they were gone. I never saw them in the basin again. I radioed Devlin and reported the elk displacement. She took the information without surprise and told me to continue monitoring. When I asked her whether previous rangers had reported similar behavior, she was quiet for a moment and then said yes. She said that Merritt Calloway had documented what he called a withdrawal zone, a perimeter around the lake that expanded slowly over the course of each autumn, within which large mammals refused to enter. Calloway had measured it at roughly 400 meters from the shoreline at its widest point. He had theorized that the animals were responding to an infrasound source, a low-frequency vibration below the threshold of human hearing that some animals could detect and that triggered an avoidance response. He had not been able to identify the source. On October 17th, I rescued my second lost hiker. This one was different. Her name was Juno Wiscott. She was 41, an experienced backcountry traveler with a shelf of certifications and a pack that was properly outfitted for a week in the mountains. She had not gotten lost by accident. She told me, sitting at the table in the cabin with a cup of tea steaming between her hands, that she had left her planned route deliberately because she heard someone calling for help. I asked her to describe what she heard. She said it was a child, a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, calling out from somewhere in the timber below the West Ridge. The voice was clear and specific. It said the word please over and over, sometimes followed by other words that Juno could not quite make out. She had left the trail and pushed through heavy brush for over an hour, following the sound, before she realized that it was not getting closer. It maintained the same distance no matter how far she walked. She described it as being like chasing a light that moved at exactly the same speed you did. Eventually, as the light failed, She had stopped and tried to return to the trail, but the forest had become unfamiliar. The terrain features did not match what she remembered. She spent the night under a fallen spruce, and in the morning she oriented herself by the sun and walked downhill until she reached the lakeshore, where I found her. I asked Juno whether the voice had sounded real, like a genuine child in distress, or whether something about it had seemed wrong. She thought about this for a long time. Then she said that it had sounded almost real, that the word almost was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. She said that the emotion in the voice, the fear and the pleading, had been convincing, but the rhythm was off. The intervals between calls were too regular. A frightened child would vary her cries, would scream and then go quiet, and then scream again in a pattern shaped by exhaustion and terror. This voice repeated with the precision of a metronome, every 8 seconds, the same word, the same inflection, the same pause. Juno left on the next supply flight. Before she boarded the plane, she took my arm and leaned close and told me to leave. She said it the way a person tells you the floor beneath you is not stable, not as a suggestion, as information about the nature of the ground you are standing on. I stayed. I need to explain why, because I know how it sounds from the outside. I stayed because the thing at the lake, whatever it was, operated on a principle I thought I could understand. It listened, it learned, it repeated. That was a pattern, and patterns could be studied. I had come to Anahke to escape the noise inside my own head, the residue of fire seasons that had burned through me as thoroughly as they had burned through the forests I was supposed to protect. What I found instead was a different kind of silence, one that was not empty but full, not peaceful but attentive, and I wanted to know what it was paying attention to. November came in like a door closing. The temperature dropped below freezing and did not rise again. Ice formed along the edges of the lake in thin, translucent sheets that crackled and groaned as the water shifted beneath them. Snow fell in brief, hard squalls that left an inch or two of powder on the ground before the wind scoured it away. The supply flights switched to a 3-week interval, then 4 as the weather windows narrowed. I was alone, fully, profoundly alone, in a way that most people never experience. The nearest human being was the fire lookout on Slate Peak, 31 miles to the southwest, and her season had ended in September. The nearest year-round resident was a retired geologist named Atsidi Redhawk, who lived in a cabin on the Methau River, 56 miles by road. I had met him once, briefly, at the district office. He was Dine, originally from the Four Corners region, and he had moved to Washington decades ago for reasons he did not share. When he heard I was stationed at Anahke, he had looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not read and said only one thing: do not answer it. I did not know what he meant. Now I think I do. The voices from the lake changed in November. They became more complex, more layered, more specific. On the night of November 4th, I heard a conversation. 2 people, a man and a woman, speaking to each other in low, intimate tones. The words were indistinct, but the emotional texture was vivid, tenderness laced with sadness, the sound of 2 people discussing something painful with care for each other's feelings. I sat at the window and listened, and I realized with a slow, spreading horror that the cadence of the man's voice matched mine, and the cadence of the woman's voice matched Rosalind's. It was not our words, I was certain of that, but it was our rhythm, the particular music of how we had spoken to each other in the years when we were still trying. On November 11th, I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of my own name being shouted from the shore. Not called, shouted, with urgency, with fear, with the unmistakable tone of a person in physical danger. I was out of bed and reaching for my rifle before the rational part of my brain caught up. No one was out there. No one could be out there. The access road had been impassable since the first heavy snowfall. The nearest trail was under 4 feet of snow, and yet the voice was so real, so specific, so perfectly calibrated to trigger every rescue instinct I had trained into my body over 15 years of fieldwork that I had to physically hold myself back from opening the door. I stood in the cabin with my hand on the latch for 11 minutes. I counted them on the clock above the stove. The voice called my name 43 times. Each time, it was identical. The same volume, the same pitch, the same microsecond of breath before the first syllable. 43 perfect copies. Not once did it vary. When it finally stopped, I sat down on the floor with my back against the door and did something I had not done since the last fire season. I shook, not from cold, from the realization that whatever was out there understood exactly what sound would make me open that door. It had studied me. It had listened to my radio transmissions, to my conversations with Devlin, to the words I muttered to myself while cooking dinner or splitting wood. It had assembled a model of me accurate enough to know my name, my voice, my instincts, and it was using that model to try to bring me outside. The question that kept me awake for the rest of that night was simple. Why? I did not hear an answer, but I felt one, in the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm arrives. The lake wanted me closer, not to harm me, not in the way a predator wants prey, but in the way a collector wants a specimen. I had the terrible, irrational conviction that if I walked to the waterline, if I answered the voice, if I engaged with it in any way, I would not die. I would simply become part of the collection. My voice would join the archive. My name would be called by the lake on future nights, to future rangers, in my exact timbre and with my exact inflection, 43 perfect copies at a time. On November 19th, I heard something that broke me. It was late afternoon, the sun already below the western ridge, the sky a deep indigo fading to black at the zenith. I was carrying firewood from the shed to the cabin, making the last trip before full night, when I heard a child laugh, not from the lake. From the tree line, 60 feet to the north, just inside the shadow of the pines. It was a small, bright sound, the effortless laughter of a child who has been surprised by something delightful. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. I dropped the firewood. I dropped it because I recognized the laugh. It was the laugh of a child I had pulled from a burnover shelter during my second fire season in Montana, a 4-year-old girl whose family's evacuation had been delayed by a road closure. I had found her in the bathtub of a house that was already burning, wrapped in wet towels, laughing because she thought the noise of the fire was thunder, and she loved thunderstorms. She had survived. I had carried her out through the smoke, and she had laughed the entire way, and that sound had lived in my memory for 9 years as the single most beautiful thing I had ever heard on the job. Now it was coming from the tree line at Lake Anahke, 60 feet from my cabin, in a valley where no child had been present for decades. I left the firewood on the ground. I went inside. I locked the door, closed the shutters, and sat in the single chair beside the stove with my rifle across my knees. I did not move until sunrise. In the morning, I went to the tree line where the laugh had originated. The snow there was undisturbed, no tracks of any kind, human or animal, not even the scratch marks of a bird, just smooth, unbroken white, as if nothing living had passed through that place in weeks. December arrived, and with it came a silence that was different from the silence of September. The autumn silence had been an absence of sound. The December silence was a presence. It pressed against the walls of the cabin like deep water. It had weight. It had texture. When I stepped outside to check the weather instruments each morning, I could feel it against my face. Not cold, not wind, but resistance, as if the air itself had thickened into something semi-solid. The voices had stopped. Completely. Since the night of the child's laugh on November 19th, I had not heard a single anomalous sound. No calls from the lake, no conversations, no replayed words or imitated voices. Just the wind, the creak of cold, stressed timber, and the faint ticking of ice expanding on the lake's surface. I should have been relieved. Instead, I was terrified. because the silence felt like patience, like the long, still pause of something that has finished preparing and is now simply waiting. I radioed Devlin on December 3rd and told her I wanted to stay through the winter. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me why. I told her I felt a responsibility to the station. That was true, but it was not the full truth. The full truth was that I had become part of a conversation I did not know how to leave. Walking away from Anahke felt like hanging up the phone in the middle of a sentence. Something on the other end was still listening, and my departure would not end the call. It would simply leave a line open. Devlin told me that no ranger had ever wintered at Anahke, that the station was classified as seasonal for a reason, that the road would be impassable until May, the lake would freeze solid enough to walk on, and the supply flights would stop entirely by mid-December. I told her I had enough food for 4 months. She told me I was making a mistake. I told her I understood. The last supply flight came on December 11th. The pilot, a taciturn man named Garvey Holm, who had been flying these mountains for 20 years, handed me the cargo crates without speaking. When he was finished, he looked at the lake, which was now covered in ice so opaque it appeared white, and then he looked at me. He said, "The Salish had a word for this place. They called it the place that listens. But the elders I spoke to said the translation was wrong. They said the better translation was the place that is learning to speak." He got back in the plane. He taxied. He lifted off. I watched the beaver until it was a dot against the southern mountains, and then I was alone. On December 18th, the lake spoke, not with borrowed voices, not with imitations or echoes or recordings played back from its vast acoustic memory. It spoke with a voice that belonged to nothing I had ever heard, a sound that rose from the center of the frozen surface and rolled across the ice like something heavy being dragged. It was low, lower than any human voice, lower than any animal call I could reference, a vibration that I felt in my chest and my jaw and the soles of my boots before I heard it with my ears, and it formed a word, my name, not in my voice, not in Rosalind's voice or Soren's voice or the voice of the child from the fire, in its own voice, a voice that sounded like it had been assembled from the raw materials of every voice it had ever collected, compressed and layered and fused into something new, something that did not belong to any individual throat, but to the lake itself, to the basin, to the granite walls and the lightless water beneath the ice. It said my name once, just once, and then it waited. I stood on the porch in the freezing air with my hands at my sides and my breath hanging in clouds, and I did what Etsidi Redhawk had told me not to do. I cannot explain why, perhaps because I had spent months listening and being listened to, and the asymmetry of it had become unbearable. Perhaps because the silence that followed the voice was so absolute, so complete, so perfectly shaped around the space where a response should go, that not answering felt like a physical impossibility, like refusing to exhale. I answered it. I said my name back to the lake. I said it once, in my own voice, and the word left my mouth and crossed the frozen shore and traveled out over the ice, and the lake received it the way a well receives a stone. Nothing happened. The sky did not change. The ice did not crack. The forest did not shift. The world remained exactly as it was, cold and still and indifferent to everything beneath it. But inside the cabin, later that night, sitting by the stove with my hands wrapped around a cup of something warm, I understood that something had changed. The silence had a different quality now. It was not the silence of something listening. It was the silence of something satisfied. I stayed at Anahke through the winter. I stayed through the spring thaw, when the ice broke apart in great angular slabs that ground against each other like tectonic plates. I stayed through the first supply flight in April, when Devlin flew in herself and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts concern and curiosity. She asked me how I was. I told her I was fine. She asked me whether I had heard anything over the winter. I told her no, that was a lie. The lake spoke to me several more times after that first night, always in its own voice, always my name, just once, followed by a long silence, and each time I answered. I do not know why. I do not know what it means. I do not know whether I am participating in something ancient and sacred, or whether I am feeding something that should have been left hungry. I only know that the conversation has begun, and I do not think it has an ending. The binder in the cabin contains the records of 11 rangers who came before me, their notes, their observations, their careful attempts to document what they experienced. They all left, every single one. They heard the voices. They felt the presence. They sensed the intelligence behind the acoustic surface of the lake, and they chose to walk away. I am the 12th, and I am still here, not because I am braver than they were, not because I understand more than they did, but because I came to this place carrying something broken, and the lake recognized it, the way a fractured note recognizes its own frequency in a returning echo. I did not come here to find silence. I came here to find something that would listen without judgment, without advice, without the unbearable human need to fix what it hears. The lake does not fix anything. It just listens. And then, very slowly, it learns to say your name. I do not know what happens after that, but I am going to stay and find out. The wind shifts. The stove ticks. Somewhere out on the frozen water, something draws a breath, and the place that is learning to speak waits for the next word. The transfer letter sat on the dash of my truck for 300 miles before I opened it. I already knew what it said. Tahawas Wilderness Preserve, Station 9, Solo Post, November through April. 6 months alone in a place the Forest Service listed as a Level 4 isolation assignment, the kind of posting they gave to rangers who either wanted to disappear or had nowhere left to go. I was a little of both. My name is Dakota Nashuba. My mother was Choctaw, born on reservation land in southeastern Oklahoma, and my father was a lineman from Duluth who never quite understood the silence she carried with her like weather. I grew up between those two worlds, the quiet of her people and the cold practicality of his, and by the time I was 26, I had done 2 tours with the National Guard, earned a degree in wildlife management from a state college nobody remembers, and landed a position with the U.S. Forest Service that paid just enough to keep my truck running and my ex-wife from calling. I took the Taoist posting because I was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, the kind that lives in your chest and makes every conversation feel like lifting concrete. My supervisor in Bozeman, a lean woman named Caldwell, had looked at me over her reading glasses when I volunteered and said, "Station 9 is not a reward, Nashuba. It is a storage closet. People go in, and they come out quieter than they went." I told her quiet sounded fine. The drive north from Missoula took me through country that got lonelier with every mile. The highway narrowed to 2 lanes, then to gravel, then to a rutted forest road that my GPS abandoned somewhere around the 3rd switchback. Lodgepole pines crowded in on both sides, their trunks so close together that the afternoon light broke into thin yellow slats across the hood. I passed a trailhead sign so old the letters had been scoured off by decades of mountain wind. Beyond it, the road dropped into a valley where the tree line thickened and the sky shrank to a strip of pale gray between the canopy. Station 9 sat at the far end of a clearing that had been cut into the forest like a wound. The cabin was Forest Service standard, built in the 1970s. Cedar plank walls gone silver with age, a metal roof stained with rust and pine sap. There was a radio tower behind it, a propane tank chained to a concrete pad, and a woodshed that leaned like it was thinking about lying down. 50 yards south through a stand of spruce, Lake Anahke filled a granite basin that stretched nearly a mile across. The water was the color of slate. Nothing moved on its surface. No birds called over it. I unloaded my gear that first afternoon, made a fire in the wood stove, and sat on the porch as the light drained out of the sky. The silence was absolute, not peaceful, not calming. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that settles against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own pulse. I had been in quiet places before, backcountry posts in Wyoming and fire lookouts in Idaho, but this was different. This silence felt occupied, as though the forest was holding its breath and waiting for me to make the first sound. I found the station logbook in a drawer beneath the radio console. The entries went back 11 years, written by 7 different rangers in 7 different handwritings, and every single one of them had left before their assignment ended. The notes were sparse, professional, the usual inventory of weather patterns and trail conditions and wildlife sightings. But the last ranger, a man named Arvid Engstrom, had written something on his final page that I read 3 times before I closed the book. The lake talks at night. Do not answer it. I told myself it was a joke. Rangers in isolation developed strange humor. I had once known a fire lookout in the Sawtooth who left notes in his logbook addressed to the mice in his walls, complete dialogues that went on for pages. Solitude did things to people. I understood that. I had chosen it. But that night, lying in the narrow bunk with the wood stove ticking as it cooled, I heard something come across the lake. It was faint, carried on the cold air that seeped through the cabin walls, and at first I thought it was a loon. Loons make sounds that can unsettle you if you are not expecting them, a tremolo that rises and falls like something grieving. But this was not a loon. This sound had consonants. It rose and fell in patterns that were too regular, too structured, too close to language without ever quite becoming words. I lay still and listened. The sound continued for perhaps 10 minutes, drifting across the water, bouncing off the granite walls of the basin, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the silence before it. I did not sleep well. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the lake. The shoreline was rocky, choked with deadfall, and the water was so clear near the edges that I could see the bottom dropping away into a blue-black nothing 20 feet out. I found no tracks along the shore, no campsites, no sign that anyone had been here in months. The tree line pressed close to the water on all sides, and the spruce and fir grew so densely that I could not see more than 30 feet into the forest in any direction. I checked the trail registers at the 2 maintained trailheads. Both were empty. No one had signed in since September. That afternoon, I radioed Caldwell and reported my arrival. She confirmed my resupply schedule, once a month by helicopter if weather allowed, and reminded me that my primary duties were trail maintenance, wildlife surveys, and search and rescue coordination for the surrounding backcountry. She asked if the station was in order. I said it was. She asked if I had any concerns. I almost told her about the logbook entry. Instead, I said no. She signed off, and the radio went back to static. I spent the rest of the day splitting wood and inventorying my supplies. I had enough food for 6 weeks, enough propane for 3 months, and a satellite phone for emergencies. The radio worked on 2 frequencies, the district channel and a weather band. My nearest neighbor was a fire lookout 40 miles northwest who would not be staffed until May. I was alone, completely, structurally, geographically alone. And for the first week, that was exactly what I wanted. The sounds from the lake came every night. By the 4th night, I had developed a routine. I would eat dinner at 6, wash my dishes in the basin by the wood stove, check the perimeter of the cabin with a flashlight, and be in my bunk by 8. The generator ran until 9, powering the single overhead bulb in the radio console, and after that the only light came from the stove and the gray wash of stars through the window glass. I would lie in the bunk and read the station manuals by headlamp until my eyes burned, and then I would turn the lamp off and wait. The sounds always began the same way, a low hum, just at the edge of hearing, like a transformer cycling in the cold. It would build slowly, rising in pitch, until it separated into threads, individual tones that wove around each other in patterns I could almost follow. Then the tones would shift, sharpening, and for brief moments I would catch syllables buried in the noise, half-words, fragments of something that had once been speech. On the fifth night, I stood on the porch and pointed my flashlight at the lake. The beam reached maybe 40 feet before the fog ate it. The surface of the water was still, reflecting nothing. But the sound was coming from out there, from the center, from a point I could not reach and could not see. And it continued for 2 hours while I stood in the cold and listened with a growing certainty that whatever was making it knew I was there. On the sixth night, I heard my name for the first time, just once, clear and unmistakable, spoken in a voice that belonged to no one I knew. Coda. A single word dropped into the noise like a stone into still water, and then silence. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat in the chair by the wood stove, with my hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, and watched the door until the first gray light crept under the plywood and told me I had survived another rotation of the earth. I began to understand why every ranger before me had left early. It was not the isolation. It was not the cold or the silence or the absence of human contact. It was the presence of something that should not have been present, a thing with no shape and no body that lived in the water and spoke in pieces of language it had taken from somewhere, and the slow, grinding realization that it was learning. On my 9th day at Station 9, I received a distress call. The radio crackled to life at 6 in the morning, Caldwell's voice coming through broken by static. 2 hikers, a married couple from Boise, had entered the Tahoe's backcountry 4 days ago on a permitted loop trail and had not returned to the trailhead. Their car was still in the parking lot at the Ridgeline access point, 12 miles east of my station. A ground search had been organized from the district office, but weather was moving in. A November front carrying freezing rain and 40-mile-an-hour gusts, and the helicopter teams were grounded. I was the closest resource. The couple's names were Bryce and Jenna Dahlhart, both 31, experienced hikers with proper gear. Their itinerary had them following the Ridgeline Trail north to the Achak Basin, then looping back south along the old mining road. They should have completed the circuit in 3 days. I packed a search kit, a 40-pound bag with emergency blankets, a first aid module, signal flares, a handheld GPS, and 2 days of food. I strapped my bear spray to my belt, holstered the service radio on my chest, and headed east along the Lakeshore Trail at first light. The weather hit 2 hours in. The rain came sideways, cold enough to sting, and the wind bent the treetops in long, groaning arcs. The trail was a creek within 30 minutes. I moved through it with my head down, watching my footing on the slick rock, and tried not to think about 2 people spending a 4th night in this. I found their campsite at mile 8, in a flat spot between 2 granite outcrops where the trail crossed a dry creek bed. The tent was still standing, a 3-season dome staked to the ground with its rain fly pulled tight. Inside I found 2 sleeping bags, rolled and dry, a camp stove with a half-used fuel canister, and a stuffed sack of food that had not been hung in a bear bag. Their packs were leaned against a rock outside, fully loaded. 2 pairs of hiking boots sat neatly beside the tent door. They had left without their shoes. I stood in the rain and looked at those boots and felt something shift in my stomach. People in distress do irrational things. Hypothermia victims undress. Panicked hikers abandon gear. But both of them, leaving both pairs of boots with their packs still loaded and their tents still standing, that was not panic. That was something else. I searched the area in widening circles. The ground was too saturated to hold prints, and the undergrowth was thick enough that a person could pass through it 10 feet away and leave no visible trace. I called their names. My voice sounded small against the wind. Bryce, Jenna. Bryce, Jenna. The forest swallowed the sound and gave nothing back. At mile 9, I found a sock, a wool hiking sock, gray with a red heel band, lying in the middle of the trail as though it had been placed there deliberately. 50 yards further, I found the other one, then a fleece jacket draped over a low branch, then a headlamp, still switched on, its beam cutting a weak yellow circle in the gray rain. The items formed a trail. They led north, away from the established path, down a slope dense with deadfall, toward the lake. I followed them, marking each find with flagging tape. And the further I went, the more I found. A water bottle, a hat, a single glove. Each one placed with a precision that made my skin crawl, spaced evenly, deliberately, as though someone was laying breadcrumbs and wanted me to follow. The trail of belongings ended at the lakeshore. I came out of the trees onto a gravel beach where the gray water lapped at the rocks in small, rhythmic waves. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the surface of Lake Anahke was flat and featureless, stretching away into fog that erased the far shore. I stood there, breathing hard, and that was when I heard it, a voice, coming from the lake. It was faint, muffled by the fog, and it was calling a name. My name, Dakota. Dakota, come help. Dakota, we are here. The voice was Jenna Dalhart's. I recognized it from a voicemail Caldwell had played for me during the briefing, a recording Jenna had left for her sister before the hike, laughing and excited and alive. This was the same voice, the same cadence, the same warmth, but it was coming from the middle of the lake, from a place where the water was 200 feet deep, and the temperature was barely above freezing, and no human being could survive. Dakota, Dakota, please. We are hurt. We need help. I keyed my radio and tried to raise Caldwell. Static. The storm was sitting on the frequency like a hand over a mouth. I tried the weather band. Dead air. I tried the satellite phone. No signal. The voice kept calling. It moved, first from the center of the lake, then from the left, then from the right, drifting through the fog like something pacing. It was patient. It was careful. And it knew my name. I backed away from the shore. Every training manual I had ever read told me to approach a distress call, to move toward the victim, to render aid. Every instinct I had told me to run. I went back to the Dalhart campsite, collected what evidence I could, and returned to Station 9 before nightfall. I locked the cabin door, wedged a chair under the handle, and sat by the radio until the static cleared enough to reach Caldwell. I reported the campsite. I reported the belongings. I reported the boots. I did not report the voice. The search teams arrived 2 days later. 12 people in orange vests with dogs and GPS units, and the grim efficiency of professionals who have done this too many times. They swept the ridgeline corridor in a grid pattern, working outward from the Dalhart campsite, and they found nothing. No bodies, no tracks, no further belongings. The dogs picked up scent at the tent and followed it to the lakeshore, the same path I had taken, and at the water's edge they stopped. Both dogs, a Belgian Malinois and a bloodhound, sat down at the gravel beach and refused to go further. Their handler, a quiet man named Rafferty, said he had never seen them do that before. The team searched for 3 days. On the third evening, they packed out. Bryce and Jenna Dalhart were reclassified from missing to presumed dead, likely drowned, and the case was handed to the county sheriff's office. Rafferty shook my hand before he left and told me to be careful. I asked him what he meant. He looked at the lake and said, "I do not know. That is what worries me." After they left, the silence returned, thicker than before, and the sounds from the lake changed. They had been formless before, those night sounds, almost musical in their shapelessness, like wind through a broken instrument. Now they were voices, multiple voices. They came in layers, overlapping, sometimes speaking in unison and sometimes staggering their words like a round. They called names. They called my name. They called Bryce and Jenna. They called names I did not recognize, names that might have belonged to the other hikers who had disappeared in this basin over the years, names I later found in the incident reports filed in the bottom drawer of the station desk. I began reading those reports. There were 14 of them, spanning 20 years, 14 people who had entered the Tahawas backcountry and never came out. Some were solo hikers, some were in groups, 2 were hunters. One was a wildlife researcher from the state university who had been studying wolverine populations. In every case, the pattern was the same: gear found intact, no sign of animal attack, no bodies recovered. And in 6 of the 14 reports, the responding ranger had noted a detail that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the wall. Personal belongings found arranged in a trail leading toward the lake. I started keeping a log, not the official one, a private notebook that I kept in my jacket pocket. I recorded the times the voices started, usually between 11 at night and 3 in the morning. I recorded their duration, anywhere from 10 minutes to 4 hours. I recorded what they said, or what I thought they said, because the words were often just beyond the threshold of comprehension, close enough to language to feel meaningful but too distorted to transcribe. On the 14th night, the voices came to the cabin. I was lying in my bunk, not sleeping, listening to the stove tick and the wind press against the windows, when I heard footsteps on the porch. Not animal footsteps, human footsteps. The slow, deliberate creak of weight on old wood, one step at a time, moving from the far end of the porch toward the door. I reached for my flashlight and held it like a weapon. The footsteps stopped at the door. There was a pause so long I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Then a knock. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, at exactly the tempo of a polite visitor. I did not answer. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. Same tempo, same force. And then a voice, muffled by the door, said, "Coda, it is Jenna. We found the trail. Can you let us in?" The voice was perfect. The cadence, the slight upward lilt at the end of the sentence, the warmth. It was her. It was exactly her. And it was standing on my porch 2 weeks after she had vanished into the wilderness without her boots. I pressed my back against the far wall and said nothing. "Coda, it is cold out here. Please open the door." The handle moved, just slightly. A test. Then it stopped. I waited. The silence poured in like cold water. I could hear my own breathing, too loud, too fast, and the tick of the stove, and the low moan of the wind in the radio tower cables. Nothing else. I waited for an hour, then 2. At dawn, I opened the door. The porch was empty. But in the frost that had formed on the planks overnight, there were footprints, bare footprints, human-shaped but wrong. The toes were too long, the arch was too narrow, and they did not come from the tree line or the trail. They came from the lake, a single set of tracks, ascending from the shore, crossing the clearing, climbing the porch steps, and ending at my door. There were no tracks leading away. I followed the prints back to the shore. They descended into the water at the same spot where the dogs had refused to go further, the same gravel beach where the Dalhart belongings had ended, and they disappeared beneath the surface as though whatever had made them had simply walked into the lake and kept going. That evening, I made a decision that I have questioned every day since. I went down to the lake at dusk. I brought the flashlight and the bear spray and a length of paracord tied to a tree at the top of the slope, a lifeline I could follow back if I needed to retreat in the night. I sat on the gravel beach and I waited. The voices started at 11. They came from the fog, from the water, from a place that had no fixed position. They called names I recognized from the incident reports: Garrison, Mullins, Ortega, Yamada, names of the missing, names of the collected. They spoke in fragments, telling stories that did not connect, describing trails and campsites and sunsets in voices that had once belonged to living people who had walked into this basin with plans and expectations and the reasonable assumption that they would walk out again. And then a voice said, very clearly, in a tone of absolute calm, "The water is warm, Coda. You would not believe how warm it is." I left. I pulled myself up the slope, hand over hand on the paracord, and I did not look back. Behind me, the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent, telling me about the warmth, about the peace, about the beauty of what waited beneath the surface. I reached the cabin and slammed the door and leaned against it, breathing in ragged gasps, and I could still hear it through the walls. "The water is warm, Coda. Come see." I radioed Caldwell that morning and requested a transfer. She denied it. November's staffing was critical. No replacement was available. I was to remain at Station 9 through the winter season as assigned. I almost told her about the footprints. I almost told her about the voices, the knocking, the 14 missing persons in the lake that collected people like stones. But I knew how it would sound. I knew the words that would appear in my personnel file: psychological stress, isolation-induced paranoia, unfit for solo assignment. So I said, "Copy that," and I signed off, and I began to prepare. December came in like a door closing. The temperature dropped to single digits. The lake froze in patches, gray ice spreading from the shore in jagged plates that groaned and cracked in the cold. Snow fell in thin, relentless curtains that erased the trails and turned the forest into a featureless white maze. My world contracted to the cabin, the woodshed, and the short path between them. The voices did not stop when the lake froze. They continued beneath the ice, muffled now, coming up through the frozen surface in vibrations I could feel in my boots when I walked the shore on patrol. Sometimes I pressed my hand to the ice and felt them humming through the surface, not sound exactly, but a resonance, a rhythm that had the cadence of speech without the clarity. It was like listening to a conversation through a wall, close enough to sense meaning but too far to grasp it. I fortified the cabin. I nailed the windows shut from the inside, covering them with plywood scraps from the woodshed. I reinforced the door with a crossbar cut from a lodgepole trunk. I kept the wood stove burning around the clock, not because of the cold, though the cold was savage, but because the fire gave me something to listen to that was not the lake. The crack and pop of burning pine was the most honest sound in that valley. Everything else had learned to lie. The knocking returned on December 9th. 3 knocks, same tempo, same force. But this time the voice was not Jenna Dahlhart. It was a man's voice, deep, calm, with the flat affect of someone reading a prepared statement. "Nashoba, this is Arvid Engstrom. I need to speak with you about the station." Engstrom, the last ranger, the man who had written "Do Not Answer It" in the logbook and then left his posting 2 months early. I had found his transfer paperwork in the files. He had been reassigned to a desk position in Helena and had resigned from the Forest Service 6 weeks later. I had tried to find a phone number for him. There was none. His personnel record listed a forwarding address in Kalispell that the district office said had been vacant for 2 years. "Nashoba, I know you can hear me. Open the door." I sat in the chair by the stove and gripped the arms until my knuckles went white. The voice continued, patient and measured, for 20 minutes. It told me things about the station that were accurate: the squeaky floorboard by the radio console, the water stain on the ceiling above the bunk, the drawer where the logbook was kept, details that only someone who had lived here would know. Then it said something that almost made me answer. "I left because I was afraid. I am not afraid anymore. Let me show you what is in the lake." I covered my ears and pressed my forehead against my knees and stayed that way until the voice stopped and the footsteps retreated across the porch and the silence came back. When I checked the porch at dawn, the same bare footprints were there, emerging from the frozen lake, crossing the clearing, climbing the steps. This time there were 2 sets. I began sleeping in 90-minute intervals, waking to check the door and listen. I ate mechanically, canned soup and instant coffee, standing at the counter because sitting at the table put my back to the window. I kept the radio on at all hours, tuned to the weather band, letting the automated forecast loop fill the cabin with the bland monotone of a synthesized voice reading barometric pressures and wind speeds. It was the only voice I trusted. On December 14th, the satellite phone rang. I had not used it since the Dahlhart search. The battery was at half charge. I picked it up and heard breathing, slow, steady breathing. the kind that a sleeping person makes, rhythmic and deep. No voice, no words, just breath. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. Same breathing. I hung up and turned the phone off. When I turned it back on an hour later to check for messages from the district office, there was one voicemail. It was 45 seconds of silence, followed by a single whispered sentence that I had to play back 4 times to understand. "We are still looking for the trail, the doll hearts." It was the phrase Jenna had used at my door. We found the trail, but inverted, twisted, as though whatever was producing these voices was assembling language from pieces, rearranging words it had harvested from the people who had come to this place and not returned. I thought about the 14 missing persons. I thought about their gear, found intact, their boots found sitting neatly by their tents. I thought about the trail of belongings leading to the water, and I began to understand something that I wished I had not. They had not been taken. They had been called, the same way I was being called, night after night, in voices that were too perfect, too familiar, too human. They had heard someone they recognized, someone they trusted, someone they loved, calling to them from the lake, and they had gone. They had left their boots and their packs and their tents, and they had walked barefoot through the forest, following the voice, down the slope, across the gravel beach, and into the water. And they had not come back. On December 20th, I woke at 2 in the morning to a sound I had not heard before. It was not a voice. It was not knocking. It was breathing. Heavy, wet, labored breathing, coming from directly beneath the cabin floor. The cabin sat on concrete piers, raised 18 inches above the frozen ground, and something was under there, something large, something that breathed with the slow patience of an animal at rest. I did not move. I lay in my bunk and listened to that breathing for 3 hours. It never quickened. It never slowed. It was metronomic, mechanical in its regularity, and it was the most frightening sound I have ever heard because it sounded like something practicing being alive. At 5 in the morning, the breathing stopped. I heard movement beneath the floor, a slow drag of weight across frozen ground, then silence. I did not go outside until full daylight. When I did, I found marks in the frost beneath the cabin, long, parallel scrapes in the frozen dirt, as though something had been lying flat on its stomach and pulling itself forward with its hands. The scrapes led from the center of the crawl space to the south side of the cabin and out into the clearing. They ended at the lake. Everything ended at the lake. I survived the winter. That sentence contains more than it appears to. I survived not because I was brave or resourceful or trained, but because I made a decision on December 21st, the longest night of the year, and I held to it with everything I had. I decided that I would not listen, not to the voices, not to the knocking, not to the breathing, not to any sound that came from the lake or the forest or the crawl space beneath my floor. I filled my ears with the weather band and the crackle of the wood stove and the sound of my own voice reading aloud from the station manuals, and I endured. The voices came every night. They grew more sophisticated. They used full sentences, complex thoughts, emotional appeals. They cried, they pleaded, they laughed. One night in January, I heard a child calling from the porch, a small voice asking for help, saying it was lost, saying it was cold, and I put my hands over my ears and recited the Beaufort wind scale from memory until the voice stopped. That was the hardest night. Something about a child's voice bypasses every rational defense you have and speaks directly to the part of you that cannot refuse to help. I did not open the door. In February, the sounds changed again. They stopped coming from specific directions and began coming from all around the cabin simultaneously, as though the entire forest had learned to speak. Voices overlapping, a dozen at a time, calling different names, asking different questions, some of them weeping, some of them whispering, all of them coming from the tree line and the lake and the space beneath the floor, a chorus of the missing, the lost, the collected. I kept my logs. I noted every incident. I documented every set of footprints, photographing them with a disposable camera I had found in the station supplies. The footprints came nearly every night now, approaching from the lake, circling the cabin, testing the door, then retreating before dawn. The number of tracks increased. In December, there had been 2 sets. By February, I counted 9. Each set was barefoot. Each set was human-shaped, but proportionally wrong, too long, too narrow, with toes that dug into the frost at angles that did not match any anatomy I knew. In March, the ice on the lake began to crack. The sound was enormous, a deep, resonant boom that echoed off the granite basin walls and shook the windows of the cabin. Each crack released the voices louder, as though the ice had been a lid and something beneath it was pushing through. On the first night that open water appeared in the center of the lake, the voices were so loud I could hear them through the plywood over the windows, through the walls, through the pillow I pressed against my head. They knew my full name. They knew my mother's name. They knew things I had said aloud in the cabin, conversations I had had with myself during the long nights, words I had spoken only to the stove and the walls. They had been listening. The entire time I had been listening to them, they had been listening to me, learning my voice, learning my words, preparing. On March 15th, I heard myself calling from the lake, my own voice, exact in every detail, down to the slight rasp I carry from a childhood bout of pneumonia, calling from the water. Coda, Coda, come see. Coda, it is beautiful down here. Come see what we found. That was when I knew I had to leave. Not at the end of my assignment. Not when the replacement came. Now. Immediately. Before whatever was collecting voices from that lake finished learning mine well enough to call someone else to the water and wear my name like a coat. I packed in the pre-dawn gloom, moving fast, stuffing essentials into my bag and leaving the rest. I left the logbook open on the radio console, with a single entry added in my handwriting beneath Angstrom's warning. He was right. Do not answer it. Do not listen. Do not open the door. And when it starts using your voice, leave. It is building something with the words it takes, and it is not finished. I drove out of the Tohoas Valley at first light, fishtailing on the muddy forest road, branches scraping the sides of my truck like fingers trying to hold me back. I did not stop until I reached the highway. I did not look at the lake in my mirrors. I did not turn off the truck engine until I was in the parking lot of a gas station in a town with street lights and traffic and the ordinary noise of human life. Caldwell called me that afternoon. She was angry. I had abandoned my post. There would be a review. There would be consequences. I told her I understood. I told her to send someone for the evidence, the logbook, the photographs, the private notebook. I told her to read the incident reports. I told her about the 14 missing persons and the footprints and the voices. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Engstrom told me the same things. I asked her what she had done about it. I sent you, she said. I resigned from the Forest Service on April 2nd. I moved to a small town in eastern Montana where the land is flat and treeless and you can see the horizon in every direction. I do not go near lakes. I do not camp. I do not hike. I work at a hardware store and I rent a room above a bar where the noise of the jukebox and the voices of strangers keep me company through the night. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between songs, I hear it, faint, far away, barely there. My own voice, calling from a distance I cannot measure, asking me to come back, asking me to come see what it found. I have learned to live with a lot of things in my life. Loneliness, regret, the particular weight of choices that cannot be undone. But I have not learned to live with the knowledge that something in that lake is still using my voice, still calling, still waiting for someone to answer. Because one day, someone will. Someone will hear a lost hiker calling for help, or a friend whispering their name, or a child crying in the cold. They will open the door. They will follow the voice to the shore. They will step into that water, and the lake will have another voice to learn. I sleep with the radio on. I keep every light in my room burning, and I never, not once, not for a second, answer when someone calls my name from a place I cannot see. Some sounds are not meant to be followed. Some silences are not empty. And some places, no matter how far you drive, do not let you leave. I took the job at Dakota Station because I was running out of places where the noise could not find me. Not the noise of cities or highways or construction, the noise inside my own head, the kind that follows a man who spent 9 years as an emergency dispatcher in Pittsburgh, listening to people describe their worst moments in voices that cracked and shook and sometimes just stopped mid-sentence. I was 34 years old. I had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in over a year. My marriage had ended quietly, the way a candle burns down to nothing, and the wick just folds over into the wax. So when the National Forest Service posted an opening for a backcountry ranger in the Adirondack Preserve, a position so remote that the nearest paved road was 19 miles from the duty station, I filled out the application the same evening. The interviewer, a regional supervisor named Glenn Holloway, told me the previous ranger had vacated the post 7 weeks early. He said this without elaboration. He asked me if I had experience with extended isolation. I told him I had been alone in a room full of people for most of my adult life. He did not laugh. He checked a box on his form and told me I would start on the first Monday of October. Dakota Station sat on a granite shelf above a lake that had no official name on any modern map, though the Algonquin word Tahawas, which translates roughly to cloud splitter, had been used for the surrounding peaks since before the land was surveyed. The cabin was small but solid, built from hand-hewn hemlock logs in the 1970s by a civilian Conservation Corps crew that had been tasked with establishing fire lookout infrastructure across the northern range. It had one main room with a wood stove, a cot, a desk bolted to the wall, and a radio unit that looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. A second room served as a storage closet packed with emergency medical supplies, signal flares, laminated trail maps, and 3 large plastic bins labeled found property. Behind the cabin, a narrow footpath led down through birch and balsam fir to the lakeshore, where a wooden dock extended 15 feet over water, so clear and so still that on windless mornings it reflected the tree line with the precision of a photograph. I arrived on a Tuesday. The air smelled like pine resin and wet stone. The elevation was just under 3,000 feet, and the temperature had already dropped below freezing overnight, despite the calendar still showing early autumn. I unloaded my gear from the Forest Service truck, signed the transfer paperwork with the outgoing seasonal maintenance coordinator, a quiet man named Lyle Jessup, who seemed eager to leave, and spent the rest of the afternoon inventorying the cabin. Everything was in order except for one detail. In the logbook kept by the previous ranger, a man named Mercer Adler, the final entry was dated August 14th, 7 weeks before the end of his contract. The entry read, Trail 9 closure extended. Sounds reported again from the eastern drainage. Request transfer. Final entry. No context. No incident report attached. I flipped back through the preceding weeks and found that Mercer Adler had been a meticulous record keeper. Weather observations, wildlife sightings, trail conditions, visitor contacts. Every entry was clean, professional, thorough, until the last 10 days. Starting around August 5th, the entries became shorter. The handwriting changed, growing compressed and angular, as though he had been writing faster, or under pressure. On August 7th, he noted, heard voice calling from northeast ridge after sundown. No registered campers in that zone. Investigated to the tree line. Found nothing. Returned to station. On August 9th. Voice again. Female. Coming from below the lake trail. Called out. No response. Did not investigate. On August 11th. It knew my name. I closed the logbook. I told myself that backcountry isolation plays tricks on people. The brain, deprived of the steady input of human interaction, begins manufacturing its own signals. I had read about it during my dispatch training. Sensory deprivation leads to auditory hallucination in a significant percentage of individuals within 72 hours. Mercer Adler had been out here alone for 5 months. It was textbook. I believed that explanation completely for about 9 days. The first week passed without incident. I hiked the trail network, checked footbridges, cleared deadfall from 2 sections of Trail 4, and logged my observations. The forest was stunning in the way that old-growth wilderness is always stunning, not because it is beautiful, though it is, but because it is indifferent. The hemlocks did not care that I was there. The lake did not care. The granite ridgeline that cut the sky to the north like the spine of some buried animal did not care. I was a temporary presence in a place that measured time in millennia, and there was a strange comfort in that. For the first time in years, the noise in my head began to quiet. On the 8th night, I was sitting at the desk writing up my weekly report when I heard someone say my name. It came from outside, from the direction of the lake. A clear, calm voice. Not shouting, not whispering, just speaking my name as though the speaker were standing on the other side of the cabin wall, having a normal conversation. I sat very still. The wood stove ticked. The wind moved through the balsam fir. I waited. The voice did not come again that night. I wrote it off as wind. Wind funneling through the drainage basin, catching the rock formations at the right angle, producing sounds that the human brain, desperate for pattern, would shape into speech. I had an explanation. It was reasonable. It was complete. And I did not believe a single word of it. On October 12th, 3 days after I first heard my name spoken from the direction of the lake, a distress call came through the radio at 6:47 in the morning. A day hiker named Josie Callahan, 26 years old, had failed to return to the trailhead parking area at the southern access point. Her vehicle, a blue Subaru with Pennsylvania plates, had been parked there for over 36 hours. A friend had called the county sheriff when Josie did not answer her phone, and the sheriff relayed the alert to the Forest Service dispatcher, who relayed it to me. I pulled her registration card from the permit box at the trailhead that afternoon. She had signed in for a day hike on Trail 6, the loop that runs along the eastern shore of the lake and climbs to Garrison Overlook before descending through a hemlock hollow back to the parking area. Total distance, 11 miles, moderate difficulty. Most hikers completed it in 6 to 8 hours. Search and Rescue dispatched a 2-person team from the regional office. They arrived the following morning. Colton Birch, a field coordinator with 14 years of experience, and a younger ranger named Delia Voss, who handled the GPS mapping and communications relay. Colton was the kind of man who moved through the woods the way water moves through a stream bed, without resistance, without wasted motion. He had a beard that looked like it had been growing since before I was born, and he spoke in short, declarative sentences that left no room for ambiguity. We divided the trail into sectors and began a systematic sweep. Colton took the northern ridge. Delia worked the mid-elevation contour. I took the lakeshore section and the Hemlock Hollow, the last stretch of trail before the loop reconnected to the parking area. The Hemlock Hollow was the kind of place that swallowed sound. The canopy was so dense that even at midday, the light that filtered through had a greenish, subaqueous quality, as though you were walking along the floor of a shallow sea. The trail narrowed to a single track between moss-covered boulders, and the air was 10 degrees cooler than anywhere else on the mountain. It smelled like earth and decomposition, the slow, patient work of fungi breaking down centuries of fallen wood. I found Josie Callahan's hiking boot at 2:15 in the afternoon. Just one boot, a Merrill Moab, women's size 8, sitting upright in the center of the trail as though it had been carefully placed there. The laces were still tied. There was no sock inside. I marked the location with flagging tape and radioed Colton. "Boot on the trail," I said. "Hemlock Hollow, about a quarter mile past the boulder field. No sign of the hiker. Copy." Any tracks? I looked at the ground. The trail surface was a mix of compacted soil and leaf litter, not ideal for tracks, but I could see disturbance. Footprints leading off the trail to the east, toward the lake. One booted foot, one bare foot. The stride pattern was wrong, too long. The spacing between prints suggested someone running, but the depth of the impressions was shallow, almost delicate, as though the person weighed far less than a full-grown adult. I followed the prints for about 200 yards. They led through a stand of yellow birch, down a steep embankment, and ended at the lakeshore. Just ended. The last print was at the waterline, pressed into the wet sand, and beyond it there was nothing. No prints in the shallows. No disturbance on the surface. The lake was a sheet of gray glass. I stood there for a long time, looking at the water. Then, from somewhere in the hemlock hollow behind me, I heard a woman's voice say, "Hello? Can someone help me?" My hand went to my radio. "Colton, I have an audible contact. Female voice. Hemlock Hollow, east of my position. Moving to investigate." "Copy. Be careful." I turned and walked back up the embankment. The voice came again, closer now. "Please, I am hurt. Can you hear me?" "Josie?" I called out. "Josie Callahan. This is a park ranger. Stay where you are. I am coming to you." "I am over here," the voice said. "Please hurry." I moved through the birch stand, following the sound. It was coming from just ahead, just beyond the next line of trees. I pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel, branches catching on my jacket, and stepped into a small clearing. It was empty, completely empty. No person, no tracks, no broken branches or disturbed ground cover to indicate anyone had been there. The clearing was maybe 30 feet across, carpeted in moss and ringed by hemlocks, so old their lowest branches started 40 feet above the ground. It was perfectly silent. Not quiet, silent. No birdsong, no wind, no insect noise. The forest had stopped making sound. "Hello?" I said, and from directly behind me, close enough that I could have felt breath on the back of my neck if there had been breath, the voice said, "Thank you for coming." I turned around so fast I lost my footing and went down on one knee. There was nothing there, just the trail I had made through the laurel, the bent branches slowly straightening, the hemlock hollow beyond. I keyed the radio with a hand that was not steady. "Colton, I have lost the audible. Clearing is empty. No visual contact, no tracks." The radio was silent for a long moment. Then Colton's voice, flat and careful. "Get out of the hollow. Come back to the station. Now." I did not argue. I turned and walked back through the laurel thicket, moving faster than I should have on uneven terrain, catching my shins on exposed roots and stumbling twice on loose stone. The silence persisted. It followed me like a pressure change, like the dead air before a thunderstorm, and it did not lift until I was 200 yards clear of the hollow and back on the main trail where the canopy thinned enough to let actual daylight reach the forest floor. The moment the sun hit my face, the birdsong returned. A nuthatch chattered somewhere above me. A chipmunk bolted across the trail and vanished into a stone wall. The forest was alive again, normal again, as though a switch had been flipped. I stopped walking and put my hands on my knees and breathed. My heart rate was somewhere north of 130. I could feel it in my temples, in my wrists, in the hollow of my throat. The sweat on my back had gone cold under my pack. I straightened up and looked behind me at the trail disappearing into the shadow of the hollow, and I felt, with a certainty that I could not justify and could not dismiss, that something was standing just inside that shadow line, watching me leave. I did not go back to check. I have thought about that moment many times in the months since, and I have never once regretted the decision to keep walking. We did not find Josie Callahan. After 4 days, the search was scaled back. Her case was reclassified from active rescue to recovery. Colton and Delia packed their gear and prepared to return to the regional office. Before he left, Colton sat with me on the cabin porch and smoked a cigarette without speaking for several minutes. "The voice you heard," he finally said, "what did it sound like? Like a woman asking for help? Did it sound like the same voice each time? Same pitch? Same cadence?" I thought about it. Yes, exactly the same. Like a recording being played back. Colton nodded slowly. He crushed his cigarette out on the sole of his boot and put the butt in his shirt pocket. "Mercer Adler told me about the voices before he left. I did not put it in any report because I did not know what to do with it. He said the thing that bothered him was not that the voices sounded human. It was that they sounded almost human, close enough to fool you from a distance, but once you were near, something was off. Like the cadence was learned rather than natural. Like something had heard a human speak and was reproducing the sounds without understanding what they meant." "What are you telling me, Colton?" He looked out at the lake. The water was the color of pewter under the overcast sky. "I am telling you that 3 rangers have staffed this station in the last 6 years. All 3 reported auditory phenomena originating from the Hemlock Hollow and the eastern drainage. All 3 requested early transfer. Mercer was the last one. The service keeps posting the position because the backcountry still needs coverage, and they do not have an explanation that fits into an incident report. I am telling you that if you hear that voice again, do not follow it. Do not answer it. Do not go into the hollow after sundown." He left the next morning. Delia gave me a small wave from the truck window. I watched them drive down the access road until the sound of the engine faded, and then there was nothing but the forest and the lake and me. That evening, I drove the station truck 12 miles down the mountain to the village of Keene Valley and asked around for anyone who had lived in the area long enough to know the history of the Tahoe Basin. The woman at the general store directed me to a man named Amos Redfeather, who lived in a small house at the end of a dirt road on the eastern side of the valley. She said he was Mohawk, that his family had roots in the region going back further than the written record, and that he did not like visitors, but might talk to a ranger if I brought him something useful. She suggested firewood. I loaded 6 split logs into the truck bed and drove to his place. It was a single-story structure with a metal roof and a covered porch cluttered with tools, animal skins stretched on frames, and stacks of old newspapers. Amos Redfeather came to the door before I knocked. He was in his late 70s, thin and upright, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the ridgeline. His eyes were the color of creek water, clear and cold and observant. "You are the new one," he said. It was not a question. "I am the ranger at Tahoe Station. I know what you are. Come inside." His kitchen smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs. He poured me coffee without asking if I wanted any and sat down across from me at a table covered in maps and hand-drawn diagrams. "You heard something in the woods," he said. "How do you know that?" "Because every one of you hears it eventually, and every one of you comes here eventually." He took a slow drink of his coffee. "My grandmother called them the Oteatan Row. In our language, it means roughly those who wear the voice. The Algonquin people, who lived in this basin before the Mohawk, had a different name. They called them the Hollow Speakers. The meaning is the same. What are they?" Amos looked at me the way you might look at a child who is asked why the sky is blue. Not with condescension, but with the weariness of someone who knows the real answer is too large for the question. "The forest is old," he said. "Older than our people. Older than any people. There are things in it that were here before language, before memory. They do not have a form that your eyes would understand, so they use form that you would recognize. A voice, a shape in the tree line, a figure standing at the edge of the water. They are not ghosts. They are not spirits. They are something else, something that exists in the spaces between what you can see and what is actually there. That does not tell me what to do. You do not do anything. You stay in your cabin after the sun goes down. You do not answer when they call. You do not follow. And you do not, under any circumstance, speak their name back to them. They learn. They remember. Every interaction teaches them to be more convincing. The ones I heard as a child sounded like wind. The ones my grandmother heard sounded like animal calls. The ones you are hearing now sound like people. Do you understand what that means? I understood. It meant they were getting better. Amos poured me a second cup of coffee. His hands were steady, his movements unhurried, and there was nothing in his demeanor that suggested he found any of this unusual or frightening. He had the composure of a man describing weather patterns or soil composition. This was simply part of the landscape to him, a feature of the terrain, like the granite or the hemlock or the water table. My uncle went into the hollow in 1961, he said. He was a trapper. He heard his brother's voice calling for help from somewhere near the drainage. His brother had been gone for 2 years at that point, moved to Albany, working in a shoe factory, very much alive, but the voice was perfect. My uncle followed it for a quarter mile before he realized the voice was not getting closer no matter how far he walked. It stayed the same distance ahead of him, always just beyond the next stand of trees, always just around the next bend. When he turned to leave, he found that the trail behind him looked different. The trees were in the wrong positions. Landmarks he had known his whole life were missing or rearranged. He wandered for 6 hours before he found his way out, and when he did, he was 3 miles from where he had entered, on a part of the mountain he had never visited. He never trapped that section again. He never went into any forest again. He moved to Albany the following month, took a job at the same shoe factory as his brother, died in 1984 without ever setting foot in woods deeper than a city park. Amos finished his coffee. The forest has rules. They are not written down. They are not posted on signs, but they exist, and they are older than any regulation your service has ever produced. I will tell you what they are. Whether you follow them is your decision. For 3 weeks after my conversation with Amos, I followed his instructions precisely. I completed my trail work during daylight hours. I was back in the cabin by 4:30 every afternoon, as the days shortened. I closed the shutters, fed the wood stove, and spent my evenings reading field manuals and writing reports by lantern light. The radio stayed on, tuned to the Forest Service frequency, a low static hum that was somehow comforting in its monotony. The voices came almost every night. They started around 8 or 9 p.m., always from the direction of the lake. At first it was the woman's voice, the same one I had heard in the hollow. "Hello? Can someone help me?" Always the same words, the same inflection, the same pitch, like Colton had said, like a recording. But over the following days it changed. The cadence shifted slightly. The emphasis moved. One night the voice said, "Please, I am so cold." And there was something in the tone that had not been there before, something that sounded almost like genuine distress, almost, but not quite. There was a quality to it, a flatness beneath the surface emotion that reminded me of something I could not initially place. Then I realized it sounded like the automated voice prompts on the dispatch system I had used in Pittsburgh, the ones generated by software that had analyzed thousands of hours of human speech and learned to replicate its patterns without possessing any of its meaning. The vowels were perfect, the rhythm was perfect, but there was no weight behind it, no lived experience producing the sound. It was imitation at a level that was almost, but not entirely, indistinguishable from the real thing. That almost was the only thing that kept me inside. On the night of November 3rd, the voice changed again. It stopped saying words I did not recognize. It said my name, my full name, first and last, spoken clearly and without distortion, as though the speaker were standing on the porch. Then it said something else. It said the name of my former wife. I sat on the edge of the cot and pressed my palms flat against my knees. I had not told anyone out here my wife's name. It was not on any Forest Service paperwork. It was not in any logbook. There was no way for any living person within 50 miles of this cabin to know that name. The voice said it again, followed by, "She is worried about you. She wants you to come outside." My wife had not spoken to me in 14 months. She was not worried about me. She had moved to Portland with a physical therapist named someone I did not care to think about. Whoever or whatever was producing this voice did not know that. It had the sound, but not the context. It had learned the shape of human concern without understanding what concern actually was. But then it said something that made me stand up. It said, "Josie is here. She is alive. She needs help. Please come to the water." I stood at the cabin door with my hand on the latch for a full minute. The wood stove crackled behind me. The lantern threw my shadow long and strange across the plank floor. Outside, the night was moonless, and the forest was a wall of shadow beyond the reach of the cabin windows. I could hear the lake, the faint lapping of water against the dock pilings. "Josie is hurt," the voice said. "She has been waiting for you." I let go of the latch. I went to the radio and keyed the transmit button. "Dispatch, this is Tahawa Station. I am requesting an incident report form for anomalous auditory phenomena. Please log the following. At approximately 2200 hours on November 3rd, the auditory contact referenced in previous reports demonstrated knowledge of personal information not available through any public or departmental record. I am recommending that the Hemlock Hollow and eastern drainage be placed under a full closure through the end of the season. Confirm." The dispatcher, a woman whose voice I recognized but whose name I had never learned, responded after a pause that felt much longer than it probably was. "Copy, Tahawas. Incident report logged. Closure recommendation forwarded to regional. Are you requesting extraction?" I looked at the door. "Negative," I said. "Not yet." I sat back down on the cot. The voice outside continued for another hour, cycling through variations. It used my name. It used Josie's name. It used words of comfort and pleas for assistance and, toward the end, a sound that was almost like weeping. Almost. The flatness was still there beneath it, like a stage actor performing grief from a script rather than from memory. Eventually it stopped, and the forest returned to its natural sounds: wind, water, the distant call of a barred owl somewhere on the ridge. I did not sleep. I sat with the lantern burning until the first gray light of morning pressed through the shutter slats, and then I got up and opened the door. There were footprints on the porch. They were barefoot, human in shape but wrong in proportion. The toes were too long, and the arch was too high, and the distance between the heel and the ball of the foot was at least 3 inches longer than any human foot I had ever seen. They came from the direction of the lake, walked to the cabin door, and stopped, right at the threshold, as though whatever had made them had stood there on the other side of the latch for a long time. The prints did not go back to the lake. They simply ended at the door. I stayed at Tahawa Station for another 31 days. I do not know entirely why. Part of it was stubbornness. Part of it was the fact that despite every instinct telling me to request extraction, there was a part of my brain, the dispatcher part, the part that had spent a decade listening to emergencies and remaining calm, that wanted to understand what was happening. Not in a scientific sense. I did not have the training or equipment for that. But in a documentary sense. I wanted to make a record. I wanted to write down what I saw and heard so that the next ranger who took this posting would have more information than I had been given, so that they would know what to expect, so that they would know the rules. The rules, as I came to understand them, were simple. Do not go outside after sundown. The voices are not people. They will sound like people. They will use names. They will use details that feel private and specific and impossible for any stranger to know. This is not because they read your mind or access your records. It is because they are listening. They listen during the day when you talk on the radio. They listen when you speak to hikers on the trail. They listen when you mutter to yourself while splitting firewood or sorting gear. They collect sounds the way a bird collects twigs for a nest, piece by piece, assembling them into structures designed to lure you out. The structures are getting more sophisticated. They are learning. Do not answer them. This is the most important rule. Every response you give teaches them something new. Mercer Adler made the mistake of calling back to the voice on August 7th, and by August 11th it knew his name. I made the mistake of speaking Josie Callahan's name in the hollow, and within a week the voice was using it. Whatever these things are, they operate on a feedback loop. Input produces output. The more input they receive, the better their output becomes. Silence is the only defense. Do not enter the Hemlock Hollow after 3 p.m. I cannot explain this with certainty, but based on my observations, the phenomena seem to intensify as the light diminishes. The hollow, due to its dense canopy, reaches near-night conditions at least 2 hours before the rest of the forest. If you must traverse it, do so in the morning. Do not follow the footprints. On 7 separate mornings during my final month at the station, I found footprints on or around the cabin. They were always barefoot. They were always the same wrong proportions. Twice they circled the entire structure. Once they went up to the shuttered window of the main room and stopped. I measured them, photographed them, and recorded their locations and orientations. I did not follow them into the trees. Whatever made them wanted to be followed. That was reason enough not to comply. Do not go to the lake at night. I cannot overstate this. On November 19th, I looked through the shutter slats at approximately 1 a.m. and saw something standing on the dock. The moon had risen behind the ridge and was casting just enough light to see the silhouette. It was shaped like a person. It was standing perfectly still at the end of the dock, facing the cabin. I watched it for 11 minutes. It did not move. Not a shift of weight, not a turn of the head, not the rise and fall of breathing. It stood with the absolute immobility of a thing that was not alive in any way I understood. Then the moon went behind a cloud, and when the light returned, the dock was empty. I found footprints on the dock the next morning, the same ones. But there was something else this time. On the wooden planks of the dock, near where the figure had stood, there were scratch marks. Deep, deliberate grooves carved into the weathered wood, each one about 4 inches long, grouped in sets of 5. They had not been there the previous morning. I had walked that dock every day since my arrival. I knew every warp and nailhead and water stain. These marks were new, and the spacing between them, the way the 5 grooves fanned out from a central point, was consistent with fingers, with very long fingers, pressing down hard enough to gouge treated lumber. I photographed the marks from 3 angles. I measured the depth with a pen tip, nearly a 1/4 inch into solid wood. I tried to reproduce the marks with my own hand, pressing as hard as I could. I could not even dent the surface. Whatever had made those gouges possessed a strength that had no analog in any animal I knew of in this region. Not bear, not cat, not anything that belonged in a forest. I went back inside and bolted the door. On my last night, December 4th, I packed my gear and sat at the desk to write my final entry in the logbook. The cabin was warm. The wood stove was loaded with seasoned birch that popped and hissed as the sap pockets ignited. Outside, the first real snow of the season was falling, fat, wet flakes that I could hear ticking against the shutters. I wrote everything I have written here, condensed into the abbreviated format of an official log entry. Observation, recommendation, transfer request. As I was writing, the voice came again. But this time it was not from the lake. It was from the porch. And it was not a woman's voice. It was mine, my own voice, speaking my own name, in a tone that was calm and measured and precisely accurate. Not almost accurate. Not close enough to fool someone from a distance. Perfect, indistinguishable from the voice I heard inside my own head when I read silently. It said my name, and then it said, "Open the door. It is cold out here." I sat at the desk and did not move. My pen was still touching the page. The ink bled a small dot into the paper where my hand had frozen. "I know you are in there," my voice said. "I have been out here for a long time. Let me in." I closed the logbook. I capped the pen. I picked up the radio and called dispatch and requested extraction at first light. The dispatcher asked if I was in distress. I told her no. I told her I was finished with my posting and would be waiting at the trailhead parking area at 0700. Then I turned off the lantern and sat in the glow of the wood stove for the remaining hours of the night, listening to my own voice on the other side of the door, asking to be let in, telling me it was cold, telling me it was alone, telling me things about my own life that I had never spoken aloud to anyone. Details it could not possibly know, should not possibly know, reciting them in a patient, conversational tone, as though we were old friends catching up over coffee. At 5:30 a.m., I opened the door. The porch was empty. The snow had covered any prints. The forest was silent and white and vast, and in the gray pre-dawn light, every tree looked like a figure standing still. I walked to the trailhead. I did not look back. The extraction truck arrived at 7:02 a.m. The driver was a seasonal employee who did not ask questions. I climbed into the passenger seat and watched the forest shrink in the side mirror as we descended the access road. When we reached the paved highway, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. I have not returned to Tahoe Station. The position was posted again in the spring. I do not know if anyone filled it. I do not know what walks the Hemlock Hollow at night or stands on the dock in the moonlight or presses its wrong-shaped feet into the wood of the cabin porch. I do not know what listened to me long enough and carefully enough to learn the sound of my own voice. But I know this: it is still learning. And every ranger who takes that posting, every hiker who wanders too far down Trail 6, every person who hears a voice in the trees and makes the mistake of answering is teaching it something new. It is patient. It has been patient for longer than any of us have been alive. And one day, if it has not happened already, it will sound so perfectly human that no one will be able to tell the difference. And on that day, when it says, "Open the door," someone will. This account is my official and only record of the events described above. I have submitted copies to the Regional Forest Service office, to the county sheriff, and to Amos Redfeather, who read it without expression and handed it back and said only, "Good. Now you know." I asked him what I should do with what I know. He looked at me the way he had looked at me the first day, with those creek-water eyes, and said, "You do what every person does when they learn that the woods are older than they thought. You stay out of them after the sun goes down. And you do not answer when something calls your name." I have followed that advice. I sleep with the windows closed now, even in summer, even in the city apartment where I moved after I left the service. I do not go hiking. I do not go camping. I do not go anywhere that the trees are thick enough to hide what stands between them. And some nights, when the building is quiet and the street outside has gone still, I think I hear it, faint, far away, muffled by distance and concrete and glass. My own voice, somewhere out in the night, calling my name, asking me to open the door. I do not answer. I never will.